Colonial Origins of Vietnam's Museums. The modern museum is a product of colonial society. Ethnographic collections arose from the Orientalist desire to extensively catalog subject races in the name of anthropology. Benedict Anderson claimed that colonial rulers in Southeast Asia were seldom interested in the antique remnants of subjected civilizations before the early 1800s. Eventually, colonial archaeological services became powerful and prestigious institutions, calling on the services of some exceptionally capable scholar officials. Metropolitan museums collected and showcased antiques from across the empire, further justifying imperial action in the name of world culture and social science. In the colonies, museums and archaeological restorations were a similarly powerful tool for domination. Quote, the formal ideological program of the reconstructions always placing the builders of the monuments and the colonial natives in a certain hierarchy. Seen in this light, the reconstructed monuments, juxtaposed with the surrounding rural poverty, said to the natives, "Our very presence shows that you have always been, or have long become, incapable of either greatness or self-rule." Many of today's museums in post-independence Vietnam were originally colonial institutions, but with a new, nationalist ethos instead of a colonial one. The History Museum of Ho Chi Minh City was formerly known as the Museum of Paul Blanchard de la Brosse, and it incorporates architectural styles from the West and Southeast Asia. The museum was renamed to the Vietnam National Museum in Saigon after the expulsion of the French in 1954. And 25 years later, the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City gave the institution its current title. The museum's changing names demonstrate how the region's identity transformed from a colonial one into a national one. This trend of colonial institutions turned Vietnamese is not exclusive to the South. The Vietnam National Museum of History in Hanoi was founded on the grounds of the Louis Feyneaux Museum, a 1926 museum, École Française d'Extrême Orient, the EFEO. Academic Orientalists created the EFEO in 1898 to encourage researchers to stay on the ground in Asia, like what is done already in Athens, Rome, or Cairo. The second wants the foundation of an institution that can take charge of the inventory and preservation of Indo-Chinese cultural heritage. Their main goal was archaeological exploration, monument conservation, manuscript collection, and the philological and ethnographic study of Indochinan ethnic groups. The EFEO even overlooked the restoration of Angkor Wat in modern-day Cambodia. By every means, the Louis Feyneaux Museum was an Orientalist and imperial undertaking. So after Vietnam earned its first taste of independence, the Vietnam government overtook and renamed the institution in 1958. The Vietnam National Museum of History is also composed of a second museum that opened that same year, the National Museum of the Vietnamese Revolution, which inhabits the original building of the Department of Indo-Chinese Commerce. While Vietnam, of course, has a multitude of original museums founded in its post-war and Doi Moi eras, the nation reclaimed colonial institutions as their own. Anderson also saw this trend while authoring Imagined Communities for its 1983 release. But even he did not know what post-colonial museums in Indochina would look like. Anderson analyzed a 1968 ceremony commemorating 15 years of Cambodian independence. Norodom Sihanouk, the Cambodian prime minister at the time, unveiled a massive wood and papier-mâché recreation of Angkor Wat's Bayon Temple in Phnom Penh's National Sports Stadium. The replica was exceptionally coarse and crude, but it served its purpose: instant recognizability via a history of colonial-era logoization. Ah, our Bayon, but with the memory of the French colonial restorers wholly banished. The EFEO conserved the temple, but that did not matter to the independent Cambodians. They would have seen the iconography of the temple and thought, this is a part of me. My people built this. Museums and cultural heritage sites have a powerful effect on collective imagination, for they make people relate, empathize, and associate with others whom they could never meet. The modern Vietnamese museum is a product of this colonial era, transformed to fit the nationalist needs of an independent and united Vietnam. Generally, Vietnamese museums split the country's national history into three periods: the ancient and pre-colonial, pre-1945, resistance against the French and Americans, 1945 to 1979, and post-independent restoration and culture, 1986 to present. The Vietnam Museum of Ethnology, the VME, in Hanoi, is the premier museum of Vietnam's pre-colonial period. It uses ancient artifacts that form a specific ethnographic history of the modern Vietnamese nation. The Vietnamese government created the museum in 1986 alongside the Dua Ma Economic Revitalization Project. The museum's self-history reflects the socialist orientations of the reformed Vietnamese identity, one that represents the 54 ethnic groups of Vietnam. The museum plans to represent more ethnic groups from Southeast Asia in the future, but it remains focused on groups within the nation of Vietnam itself. The multi-ethnic narrative initially seems to conflict with ideas of nationalism, but the entry foyer reaffirms guests that certain ethnic groups are distinctly Vietnamese. The foyer displays maps of major ethno-linguistic groups of Southeast Asia and within Vietnam, and passages explaining the main ethno-linguistic groups shift between situating each group within the Vietnamese nation-state and relating the position and history of each group within the region. For example, noting which groups created nations such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. These maps not only constrain fluid ethnic groups within artificial modern borders, but they also differentiate between which groups are Vietnamese and which are others. Still, the Vietnamese Museum of Ethnology is one of the few museums in the country that gives much consideration to the multi-ethnic makeup of Vietnam. Before the French and American Wars, colonial entities brought with them both the Western Imperial Museum and the objectifying study of Orientalist ethnography. Once France and the United States were defeated in Vietnam, independent Vietnam adjusted these institutions to reclaim a specific national identity. The Vietnamese government reclaimed these colonial museums and redeveloped them into powerful tools of inspiring nationalism. Of course, this moment makes sense, for it is common for post-colonial states to use museums to redefine the nation.